Well, good morning to everyone out there. Welcome to another Thursday morning live stream, and we're thrilled that you've joined us today. Hope you all enjoyed yesterday's inauguration. What an amazing event that was from the brilliant young poet. I saw her interviewed on CNN later, and my goodness, she is a force. And boy, we have such incredible diversity in this country and such amazing voices in this country, and it's amazing to have them back on the right stage. And of course, President Biden's speech was truly something extraordinary. And then all that music and that fireworks display last night, I've never seen anything like that. I doubt any of us have. That was quite something. So just a couple words from me about some of our upcoming talks before we get to today's. Of course, we have a lot of talks coming up, which is exciting. And in this Zoom virtual world, as much as we can feel a little boxed in by it, it does present us with all kinds of amazing opportunities to bring in speakers from around the state, the country, and the globe. Thursday next week, a week from today, we'll be looking at Biden's foreign policy priorities, and we'll be featuring Todd Greentree, who many of us know and have listened to him speak before, and he's got so many fascinating things to say. And he, of course, is in Jordan right now, so we'll be broadcasting that from the Middle East. Then on the 2nd of February, we have a great talk from the Santa Fe, in partnership with the Santa Fe Institute, called The Avalanche of Violence, where researchers will be showing us some of the amazing connections that they've drawn between all the different violent conflicts around the world and helping us understand some of the patterns within that. And moderating that discussion will be Santa Fe's own Rachel Kleinfeld, who is such a brilliant, brilliant mind, and who has, of course, done a lot of work on that same topic. So that right now is only available for registration to our $150 and up members. And then on Monday, the 25th, we'll be sending out a link for a general public registration. And that's going to be quite something. Then on Thursday, February 4th, we're going to go to Saudi Arabia and talk all about human rights there. We have Ali Aliami, who is the director of the Center for Democracy and Human Rights in Saudi Arabia, and he'll be joined in conversation with Dr. Emil Nakle from UNM, whom many of us know as just a brilliant speaker on all things in the Middle East. Our Great Decisions program is an 8-part discussion series. It begins on February the 9th and then will unfold every Tuesday at 10 a.m. This is an opportunity for you to read all kinds of things related to specific topics, and then we come and discuss those topics on Tuesdays. We'll have a presenter who will lead us in a presentation on that, and then we'll open the floor to you for your comments, your ideas, your questions, and we can have a nice discussion on them. Then, and you see, I just have this bevy of conversations coming up. Wednesday the 10th, we have ASU professor Brad Allenby, who is a true Renaissance man and a dazzling intellect. He's spoken for us 3 different times before, and boy, I'm sure looking forward to his discussion about information and how information has changed over the millennia, and how we are in this bizarre, amazing, empowering, intimidating world of information now, and what we ought to do about that, and how our institutions need to effectively respond to information. And I think we've just gone through 4 years of understanding how institutions can and cannot and should not respond to misinformation and lies and so on. And then the last thing I'll point out is on Thursday, February 11th, we have 2 former ambassadors joining us, one from the United Kingdom and one from France, who will discuss, in conversation with Ambassador Vicki Huddleston, their hope for policy changes and the challenges the Biden-Harris administration will confront. So with all of that now out of the way, let's us move now to today's talk, and let me introduce our speakers. We have 2 of them joining us from afar. Well, one not that far. Edl Schamiloglu, let me introduce you first. He is, of course, down the road in Albuquerque. He joined the University of New Mexico as an assistant professor in 1988, and he's currently Distinguished Professor of Electrical and Computer Engineering and Associate Dean for Research and Innovation in the School of Engineering. Good morning, Edl. Welcome.
Good morning, Sandy, and good morning to my panelists, James and Ambassador Huddleston.
So that is a great segue to our next introduction, James Giordano. He's a professor in the departments of neurology and biochemistry, chief of the Neuroethics Studies program, director of the program in biotechnology, biosecurity, and ethics of the Cyber Smart Center, co-director of the program in Science and Global Health Law and Policy, and chair of the subprogram in Military Medical Ethics at Georgetown University. Welcome, James. It's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you very much, Sandy. And Edl, it's good to see you again. And Madam Ambassador, great to see you this morning.
And lastly, of course, we have Ambassador Vicki Huddleston, who will lead this discussion. This topic is, of course, near and dear and harrowing, perhaps, for her heart, given that she led U.S. diplomatic mission in Cuba, also having done the same in Madagascar, in Mali, and Ethiopia. Ambassador Vicki, welcome once again, and let me turn the proceedings over to you.
Thank you, Sandy. I am so delighted, and I have been so looking forward to this program and to be able to discuss with two of the world renowned experts on uh, neuro brain issues, an ethicist on this, and then with Edl, who really has been involved in high frequency radio waves all his research time at the University of New Mexico. Uh, I am going to start and talk a little bit about Cuba and my experience there because I think that leads directly to what happened. Um, when I was in Cuba, I had this absolutely gorgeous office in the then intersection, but the intersection was in what became the embassy. The embassy had been built right before the revolution, and it looks like a little UN. It's right on the Malecon or on the what actually the U.S. Corps of Engineers, civil engineers built years and years ago, I believe in the 30s, before the First World War. And so the embassy's just out there alone. There's only one side that faces another building. And I used to look out at my gorgeous office, which was glass on three sides, and see this camera with listening device pointed directly at my office. And one day, one of the intelligence officers said to me, "You know, your brain is going to be fried by the time you leave here." Unfortunately, I can't blame the Cubans for a fried brain or anything else. And in fact, the injuries that occurred to our diplomats actually didn't happen at the embassy. Sometimes you see that they happened there, but in fact they didn't, and they couldn't have, because most of the injuries did occur to intelligence officers, and intelligence officers are not located in areas where high frequency radio waves could reach them. So then let's jump ahead. This was 2002 when I was worried about my brain frying, to 2016 when this happened. It happened in November 2016, which, as you recall, was the time of another election. And Obama was just leaving office, and Trump had been elected. And the first incidents actually occurred in November, shortly after the elections, and then there were more incidents in 2017. It didn't become actually public until around the summer of 2017. Uh, when it happened and became public, I mean, up until that point, everyone was trying to figure it out. And the FBI went down twice, said that Cuba was not involved. They couldn't figure out what had occurred. In my book, which I remembered to bring this morning, Our Woman in Havana, I talk about what might have happened, and I speculate that it might have been psychological, it might have been radio waves, it might have been chemical. When I was in Cuba, I got dengue fever, and when the Cubans learned I had, they started spraying all over. So it could have been that as well. And no one knew. So eventually, the people who had been affected, and in the end, I believe there's more than 35. We'll ask James about that. And not only Americans, but also Canadian diplomats, and then a few diplomats in Guangzhou, the largest U.S. consulate in China. So there was lots of confusion. What happened? But the one thing I could definitely say in my book is that if it was an attack, it was done by the Russians. And I think that we have probably come very definitely to that conclusion, should it be the high powered microwaves, or as the report from the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine says, that it is high pulse, let me try to get this right, pulse radio uh, frequency energy, which I think Edl will say is high powered microwaves. And that will be exactly what we'll be discussing today, because it now looks like that might have been what happened to the diplomats in their homes, not in the embassy, because as I mentioned, it would have been very, very difficult to have taken place at the embassy and in at least two hotel rooms, two different hotel rooms, one the Hotel Nacional and another one closer to the embassy. So with before I end, I wanted to talk a little bit about whether Cuba might have done it, uh, because this was during when it started during the Obama opening. And Cubans were delighted. Uh, Everyone was so looking forward to the possibility of better jobs, better income, and to include the government. So just kind of keep that in your mind as we move forward and begin to explore the issues with our experts. So I'm going to turn to Dr. James Giordano, who as a neuroethicist, and I believe, I have to check again, may have spoken to some of the people who were involved, what happened to the diplomats and his speculation on how it might have happened. James?
Thank you. So I was contacted in late 2016 by members of the Department of State in light of my ongoing role as a neuroscientist, neurotoxicologist, neuropathologist, as well as some of the work we've been doing with the ethics of using various forms of neuroscience and technologies in national security, intelligence, and defense. Some of our ongoing projects had been conducted since the early 2000s in examining the way these techniques and technologies have been used on the world stage. And what I was asked to do in late 2016 and then later on in 2017 was to examine the data that was provided by the examining physician, Dr. Michael Hoffer in Florida, of a group of personnel who were stationed at the US Embassy in ancillary roles and tried to determine three things. What would be the nature of the findings that were concluded by a variety of medical examinations over that period of time, and they were serial medical examinations and iterative. And then number two, what could have done this? So the process that I was asked to engage is something called abductive forensics. In other words, you don't have all the information, but based upon the information you have, what can you speculate as to what would be possible? And from those possibilities, utilizing a scientific approach to analyze what's scientifically capable and what's technologically feasible, both at present, and perhaps with a little bit of embellishment on the existing technologies, what would be most probable? So at that time, we were asked to examine these data based upon a whole range of findings that had been conducted in about 24 individuals. And there were tremendous overlap in both their signs, their objective signs, and their subjective symptoms that would have suggested that clearly something happened to these individuals that was physical. And upon examination, it exhibited the characteristics of what might be a mild traumatic brain injury. In other words, a concussive type event. Yet these individuals didn't suffer a concussion. There was no evidence of concussion. There was no report of concussion. And moreover, there was no communication to any great extent among and between these individuals prior to their medical report. So the idea of this being, quote, mass hysteria, at least early on, or a psychosomatic or psychogenically induced phenomenon, became pretty dubious. So early on, what I was asked to do is say, all right, what could have happened here? Based upon, again, the signs, the objective signs, and the symptoms that these individuals presented with and continue to present with over a period of time. And the early speculations were that the possibilities were it could have been something chemical, it could have been something electronic and or some form of directed energy. It could have been a combination of both. So there may have been a toxicological element, and there may have been some other form of traumatic element based upon some form of directed energy. We ruled out the toxicological element pretty quickly because the doses that would be necessary to induce these sorts of effects would have been evident in a variety of different samples of tissues and fluids that were taken at the time, number one. And number two, there would have been a lot more collateral effects on other people, and there simply weren't found. These were not found. So then the idea was, all right, could it have been that these individuals were specifically targeted with something, perhaps a very specific drug or a microbe? Here too, there was evidence that really mitigated that possibility. So it came to the probability that these individuals were subjected to or were in range of some form of energy, directed energy either artifactually or accidentally or intentionally. And that's where we left off at that time. So the idea was something happened here. Clearly, there were disruptions in these individuals' physiology in terms of a number of different signs and symptoms. There were indications that there had been some traumatic insult or an injury to their brain, and this was verified subsequently and then iteratively. And so what we were left with is no entrance wound, so to speak, no exit wound, so to speak, and a lot of things in between that seemed to suggest a brain injury when there was no evidence of a brain injury to be had. These people didn't hit their head, they weren't hit over the head, and yet that's what we were left with. The conclusion at that time was it wasn't something chemical, it wasn't something microbial, but clearly these people were in range of something that had to do with some form of energy.
And so, of course, that brings us to Edl, because he's the man who knows what happened, at least according to the National Academy of Sciences and the work that you've done, Doctor. Uh, the most likely cause, and it says this in the report, are the pulse radio frequency energy. So, Edl, how do you use pulse radio frequency energy to attack these diplomats? I saw that you had in your laboratory a machine that produces these that you actually obtained, I think, from the Soviet Union when Russia was still the Soviet Union, and you were cooperating with Russia on these issues. Um, it was a little big, it seems to me, to have carted around Havana and pointed at the diplomats' home. So give us your understanding from your depth of knowledge of how this could have happened.
Yes, thank you, Ambassador. And just to clarify, I don't know that high power microwaves were the pulsed RF energy that was used, but I hypothesize that they very well may be. So just as a background, I'm a plasma physicist, and plasma physicists study how particles such as electrons and waves exchange energy. So my research program at the University of New Mexico for the last 33 years has in fact focused on developing ever higher powers of microwave. And when the National Academies said RF, I will use RF and microwaves synonymously. It's the same thing. So why are folks interested in ever higher powers of microwaves? There are many applications. The whole accelerator world is based on using high power microwaves to drive accelerator cavities. There's interest in power beaming, putting satellites orbiting with solar panels and then collecting the energy and returning it to Earth via high power microwaves. But the military, the DoD in this country, is very interested in using directed energy microwaves for what they call counter electronics. So the idea is if you can have these systems flying or on vehicles, they can disable an adversary's ability to communicate, their ability to track, and things of that nature. So it's termed a non-lethal form of directed energy. As the ambassador pointed out, I have an accelerator in my lab that I went to the Soviet Union in 1991 and negotiated its acquisition in Russian, by the way, because my Russian was better than their English. And this was all a consequence of perestroika and just the warming of relations between the US and the Soviet Union. So I traveled to the Siberian city of Tomsk in October of 2001. And it arrived in my lab in July of 2002, along with 5 Russian colleagues. I had a very strong collaborative working relationship with them until my last publication with them was 2004. Putin came on the scene in 2000, and pretty much after 2004, we stopped communicating. We just see each other at international conferences. We're still very close. We have excellent relations. So I know the technology that was developed in the former Soviet Union, and that technology, in my mind, is perfectly aligned with the type of technology that's needed to deliver targeted, repetitively pulsed, high power RF energy. And by the way, yes, the device in my laboratory is large, but that's a laboratory device intended to do physics and engineering. It's not a practical device to do anything portably. There are devices out there that were developed in Russia that have a power supply that's about the size of a laser printer, and the entire length of the device might be 1 meter, and the device might weigh 100 pounds. So clearly, these devices can be made small, and it is my opinion that these are devices that need to be repetitively pulsed for a relatively long duration. So I'm talking about minutes to tens of minutes, and that technology can do that. And when you do that, you don't need super duper high power. If you have sufficient power, and if you repetitively insult the victim, then yes, that's my opinion as to what happened. And when I first read about the Havana syndrome in 2017, the first thing that came to my mind is this is the technology that, in my opinion, most likely was used, and the Russians were behind it.
And it makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I agree with the Russians. And it sounds as if the pulsed RF is the likely cause. However, the Japan Institute of Electromagnetic Fields says no way. There was no burn. If the frequency was high enough, it might have to be a burn, and that there were sound and there shouldn't have been sounds. Various other reasons they say it couldn't have been from radio frequencies. So
I think they're flawed. I think their logic is flawed because these are short pulses of high power, and because they are short pulses, there's hardly any energy content in them. So each pulse is about perhaps 10 joules of energy. That's not, even if you repetitively pulse this for 10 minutes at a certain repetition rate, it's not sufficient energy. You're not going to have any burns. I think the Japanese report is just ignorant of the technology that's out there. And by the way, this technology did flow from Russia to China beginning in the 2000s. I had discussions with my Russian colleagues how initially they were reticent to export the technology to China. But then it happened. And I remember I was in a conference in Xi'an, China in 2008. It's the International Beams Conference. I'm sitting next to my colleague from Tomsk. And lo and behold, the Chinese present a plenary paper showing their new device, which they called Torch 1. And I looked at my colleague and I, hit him on the elbow. I said, what do you think? They just copied your technology because a year earlier, they had purchased a device. And in 1 year, they were able to clone it. And my Russian colleague said, on the one hand, I'm very upset, but on the other hand, it forces us to become more creative and more innovative.
Well, we know the Chinese are great at copying, and that may well explain the incidents in China. But, James, talk about why you think it's the. I'm assuming that you agree with Edel and myself that it's the Russians.
Uh, I, I really can't. The issue there is it could be anyone. I mean, anyone who has the capability to develop the technology sufficiently, as was demonstrated by the former Soviet Union and ultimately the tech transfer that became Russia, and then the technological transfer that was then provided to China. It could have been articulated by a proxy, a directed proxy, a non-state actor, essentially out of my sandbox, if you will, out of my wheelhouse to sort of point a finger and say, I think it's X, Y, or Z that did this. However, where you have existing technology, what you have to look at what's called the technology readiness level. In other words, how prepared is that technology to be three things? Number one, put in operation. That's called operationalizability. Number two, how scalable is it? In other words, if this thing is the size of a dump truck, can you reduce it down to be something the size of a bread box? And number three, how fieldable is it? In other words, how portable is it? How easily can you get it to whatever's going to be its field of operationalizability, and how scalable? And as Edl has well stated, we know that our Russian colleagues have in fact spent a tremendous amount of time looking at all three of those variables with regard to directed energy devices: operationalizability across a range of potential uses, scalability, and fieldability. And equally, we know that ongoing research and ongoing research in translational effort, what's called research, development, test, and use, has also been engaged by our Trans-Pacific near-peer competitor at a number of their former military universities that also have medical branches, with the idea of utilizing directed energy as possible biomedical means of engaging deep tissues. So the technology readiness is certainly there. The technology engagement is certainly there. The dedicated programs are certainly there. But I think it becomes difficult to say, well, this is who did it. Do we know who's working in the area? Yes, absolutely. Do we know the number of different potential actors, either directly or indirectly, that could have been engaged as proxies or could have obtained the technology through a variety of different shields of provenance? No, we don't. And that's part of the problem, because as you do recall, when we pointed an accusative finger at our Cuban colleagues, they were very, very quick to come to the table and say simply, no, that's not the case. We weren't involved in this. Now, might there be some idea of some level of contribution? Might there be some complicity? Might there have been some laxity? Might there have been some, as we call, provenance or custodialship that may have been involved? Hard to say. Once again, without finger pointing, without having that direct evidence, now socio-political and legal evidence, it becomes very difficult to determine. As Edl well noted, using this technology, if not demands, I think importantly requires on some level an understanding, insight, and perhaps even analysis of the environments in which it's going to be used. The geographies and geometries, the architectures of the residences or locales it's going to be proffered to. And to some extent, what we're very concerned about is the actual measurements and characteristics of the individuals themselves. Now, in my ongoing conversations with Edl and my conversations with another colleague of mine who's been working on this, Dr. Kerry Balaban of the University of Pittsburgh, that latter factor remains a bit moot. It may not necessarily be that direct measurements of these individuals' physical dimensions, their dimensions of their head, and then extrapolations as to various bodily cavities would be wholly necessary. But if we got that information, would it have been helpful? Oh, sure, it would have been helpful. Let's face it. The more I know, the deeper I can go. The more data I have, the more specific I can create sharp shot rather than buckshot. So these are variables that still remain undetermined in terms of the amount of intel we call human intel or anthropologic intelligence that may have been available from these individuals. But even if none of that was available, a simple assessment and analysis of the geography, the geometries, the architectures, and the relative positioning of these individuals at time of day and place may have been sufficient to be able to induce these types of injuries using just this type of directed energy.
And I would like to add that this technology is not something that a tinkerer can put together in their garage. This is a nation state developed technology.
And also, we know the Russians did use similar technology against our diplomats in Moscow. So perhaps, that puts another weight on the scale for the Russians. I I cannot imagine that it would have been another state actor other than China. But China doesn't have that kind of relationship with Cuba. Russia has a relationship like this with Cuba, particularly the Russian military. But here's the problem for me. The Cubans would have had to help the Russians because it's the Cubans who know the houses that have listening devices at everybody's houses, to include video devices, who enter your house when you're not there. So the Cubans know the houses in the hotels. They bug the hotels. So the Cubans have the knowledge. And I think for the Russians to have done it, they would have had to rely on the Cubans. The question is, why would the Cubans do that when they were looking forward to better relations? And so I have speculated in my book and in conversations, and I'd love your comments on this, particularly you, James, that it might have been a hardline Cuban faction that was unhappy. You remember Fidel Castro was unhappy with the opening. So were conservative Cuban Americans who supported President Trump, who eventually then returned our relationship to a Cold War status. So maybe it was a faction, an intelligence military faction of the Cuban government working with the Russian government. Or is that too far out?
No, I don't think it's too far out. I think that any real stance on looking at potential risks or threats to biosecurity needs to anticipate both preparedness in terms of what the capabilities are and readiness. That is to say, readiness for these things to happen. Is the ecology ripe for this on one level or another? I mean, let's face it, to grow weeds in your backyard, you don't need a bunch of them. All you need is a couple of seeds and a permissive environment. And as we well know, these are non-kinetic engagements. They don't constitute warfare on a formal level. So being able to entertain this type of thing, or engaging discussions that said, look, what we'd really like to do is to perhaps surveil these individuals. Could you provide us with the architectures, the geometries and geographies that would be necessary to allow that necessary surveillance? If such an operation were clandestine, at least, or more covert at most, it may have been that they could have involved operators on the Cuban side who may not have been wholly knowledgeable of the nature of the operation itself, but rather were more like pawns versus pieces on the chessboard. Now, is it also possible, as you well alluded to, ma'am, that there may have been operative pieces that had other forms of involvement, particular consternation about a building relationship with the United States, or more favorable, for example, to ongoing hegemony in the area by Russia? Sure. Could these have been operators who then would allow, by a permissivity, some level of engagement and in that way become complicit? Sure. Do we know that? No, we don't. But to get back to something that Edl had said and that you had alluded to earlier on, is the nature of what could have actually happened. Early on, we were leaning more towards this being some form of radio frequency wave directed energy that may have produced some type of sonic effect that in some cases was relatable to an earlier known phenomenon known as the Fry effect. And we thought that perhaps a more generalized use of this, whether in a listening device gone bad or in some form of an intentional directed energy device that's going to be interventional, in other words, it has an action rather than just a passive mode of listening, that this might then cause disruptions in various tissues and fluids. In other words, if you think of a waveform, any waveform that's pulsed, it expands and it contracts, and it expands and it contracts. And as it passes through various tissues and media that have different resonances, it causes these effects in those media, in those tissues, and it disrupts the flow or stability. And what we were originally thinking is, well, perhaps what we're seeing is something known as a communicating cavitation injury. In other words, you're causing tissue to expand and contract, fluid to expand and contract, And when you get that, you then get like a bubbling in fluids of the inner ear, perhaps fluids that then communicate into the fluid that rounds the brain, brainstem, and spinal cord, and perhaps even direct transmission into the blood that would then cause a bubbling effect that would then have a downstream effect that would be very, very similar to what we'd see in something like decompression illness, decompression sickness. That was the original thought. And the reason we ground much of the speculation to that possibility was that that would have presumed the basis of a fairly generalized, not terribly complicated device that didn't need to do anything more specific than that to create these types of disruptions that we initially saw and that continue to be manifest iteratively in these individuals with time. However, based upon the new information that is coming from these patients and what we're seeing, the thought now is that a bit more may have been going on, that the nature of this device may have been far more complex, and that what this device may have actually done is perhaps more than one effect, a crude effect that may have caused this type of cavitation insult, but more specifically, an effect that then changes the network communication capabilities of the cells of the brain. Our brain is a communicating organ. It's a network of systems that rely upon very, very precise interactions on a variety of levels from the subcellular all the way to the systemic. And we have groups of cells that aggregate, that clump together in their function that are called cliques, and they create nodes, and those nodes then create networks, and it's these reliable networks that function to do what brains do. You can disrupt these in a variety of ways. And one of the ways that these things could be disrupted by creating waveforms that essentially put many of these network patterns out of sync. So what you're really getting here is a functional disruption. And that functional disruption causes, I'm going to use a word colloquially, something of a rewiring, or at least a re-networking, that then causes more long-term structural changes. In addition, you may have also had an artifact or an additional effect that may have even been a desired effect of some cavitation. So the question here is really what represents the primary means of insult and the secondary means of insult. And we also know, as Edl will confirm, that often, particularly when utilizing these types of directed energies across a range of fields and differences, what you might find is that differences in what we call resonance and impedance might cause certain individuals to actually perceive some element of the energy, usually in a sensation. And if that sensation occurs in and around the middle and inner ear, it can be heard as a clicking sound or a whistling sound during the initiation and during the termination of the wave, which then led us to believe that this may not have been sonic, as we initially thought, that the sonic component was secondary to a much more sophisticated, more highly complex, and certainly more intentional form of directed energy that was aimed at causing functional disruption in brain network activity and not just a crude disruption of the micro and macro structure of the brain.
And
And
so
I think,
then motive. Go ahead, Edl.
yeah, I just want to point out that I think all of this points out that although the National Academy study did a very good job, had eminent members on the panel, it did not have subject matter experts on the possible technology that could have been used. And I think all of this points out that the work done thus far, at least that I'm aware of, has been incomplete. And I think that this needs to be revisited to get to the bottom of this.
Yeah, and let me confirm that as well. I mean, some of the work that had been done, again, by my esteemed colleague, Dr. Kerry Balaban at the University of Pittsburgh, suggested that although a Fry type effect would certainly be possible, that the nature of the insult might be probable to be more than that. In other words, yeah, that it may be a secondary or tertiary radio frequency effect, and that the sonic effect may have been artifactual or incidental. But if this was somewhat more sophisticated, that would need to be examined. And that was explicated when we had done some work down with Special Operations Command in Tampa as Donovan Center Fellows. It was pretty clear that the nature of whatever energy was used may have had multiple effects, not simply sonic, certainly existed within the possible microwave range, did not necessarily have to induce any form of topical disruption, burns, heat, based upon various waveforms that could have been used. And that we needed to model that in greater detail, not to simply reach initial conclusions as to what was used. And as the information continued to evolve, as these patients continued to progress with various signs and symptoms over time, it became rather clear that something a bit more sophisticated and or complex was being used or had been used. And as a consequence, the nature of the insult that then caused this type of functional disruptive injury was probably far more sophisticated than we first imagined.
And I would like to, basically as a final comment, point out that I view this no different than all the cyber attacks that have been originating in Putin's Russia. This is just another tool in their arsenal to be able to covertly affect things. And look at the bottom line. The bottom line is our relationship with Cuba now has been, kicked back 30 years. And so obviously it was successful. And it's just a repeated pattern of Putin trying to influence and affect our country.
And if I may, let me support that as well. And again, here a deep nod of homage to my colleague, Captain Rick Bremseth, United States Navy SEAL retired. For a number of years, Captain Bremseth and I were looking at the viability of engaging what's called non-kinetic engagements. In other words, doing things that are essentially under the threshold wire for what would be considered an act of war. And radical leveling, in other words, existing technologies and emerging technologies make these types of engagements ever more possible. And let's face it, working on the non-kinetic level gives the aggressor a +1 advantage. This is a +some advantage for anyone who initiates this, because you can do two things. Number one, you can say simply we didn't do it. It doesn't constitute an act of war. It was way below the threshold of what would be considered inductive for some type of diplomatic military response. And number two, you have to prove it. And very often utilizing these technologies in such a way that you can target these technologies towards specific individuals that can have a mass disruptive effect with ripple effects that can be destructive on a variety of ranges from the cellular all the way to the socio-political. And second of all, what it does is creates a zero-sum effect in the recipient. Because if you do posture and then say, well, this was an act of war, and you go to retaliate in a way that would be kinetic, in other words, in a warfare-like and or more aggressive pattern, you then have to get into issues of commensurability, proportionality, the actually demonstrating that this was done. And so utilizing radical leveling and emerging technologies in non-kinetic engagements in ways that are clandestine or covert really represents the 21st century battlescape. And I must say that our near-peer competitors are investing considerable time, energy, efforts, and enterprise towards examining what this new battlescape might be. And much of that exists on the biological front. The reason being that these types of things are not currently dictated, they're not currently overseen, and certainly not well directed or governed by existing treaties and other forms of signatory engagement, such as the Biological Toxins and Weapons Convention. And although a couple of years ago, the Australia group presenting to the conference of the Biological Technologies and Toxins and Weapons Convention brought the idea of neuro devices to the fore, once again, this still has not been fully ratified, fully discussed and or discoursed. And as a consequence, this then represents a viable gray zone.
But I have to say, as a diplomat, what I find most discouraging about this, particularly after listening to you two who are experts in the field, is the very political way in which it was handled, which means we have not retaliated against anyone except Cuba, which probably was not culpable, or if it was culpable, only in an ancillary manner. Uh, we instead, it was used, this attack by Senator Marco Rubio, to convince President Trump, whose supporters had been conservative Cuban Americans who wanted to roll back the Obama opening. Remember, Obama was there in Cuba with Raul Castro in July of 2016, and then 6 months later, these attacks begin. And as a result of the attacks, which Rubio politicized, we essentially shut our embassy. We cut off all consular uh, duties, responsibilities to Americans, and then drew down the embassy to a shadow or a skeleton crew of people who were basically there just for 6 months and put a low-level charge in charge. And we forced the Cubans to do the same in Washington to their embassy. So after Obama and Kerry had created an embassy, Kerry raised the flag at our intersection, which then became the embassy. Uh, we turned into a non-entity. Before that, we had been essentially the largest diplomatic mission in Cuba. We had major influence, in particular with human rights activists, but because the conservative Cuban Americans had lots of influence with the Trump administration, it was used as a rationale for really cutting off our relationship with Cuba. So, last question, couldn't have we done this a lot better? Couldn't have we gotten to
Yes, ma'am.
which nation state was responsible sooner and then done something in retaliation?
Well, let me leave the last part up for grabs because I think that's more of a political question than one dealing with the science and technology. But I think there are three factors that come to the fore. And these are factors that have been reinforced, for example, by the recent debacle with the COVID crisis. We had awareness of the technology and its relative readiness. We were aware of that. I mean, certainly Edl's conversation today brings that into complete evidence. We knew these things existed. We've been talking about the viability of a potential neuro weapon for well over a decade and a half, and we recognized who our competitors in this space were. We even have ongoing programs that, at least in part, were focal to examining what progress in the field was. And we were a bit slow, I must tell you. In 2008, the National Academies National Research Council looked at neurosciences and neurotechnology and said, not ready for prime time. We disagreed strongly. And fortunately, that council reconvened in 2014 and said, not only are these things ready for prime time, but they're probably engaged in some form of prime time activities in national security, defense, intelligence agenda worldwide, most notably by our near peer and strategically latent competitors. Point number one. Point number two, it was a communicated risk, harm, and threat. The idea of utilizing the brain sciences in these ways and other forms of novel techniques and technologies was clearly explicated in Mr. Coates' report to the Special Senate Committee in 2019. That report was collected, as you know, and we were contributory, at least in part, to some of that information throughout 2018, so that the relative clarity of these threats was made apparent to the executive branch. And third is that, as my colleagues at the State Department would well ratify and certainly would agree with, we're not preparing our individuals overseas for these types of biothreats. That realistically, the need for biothreat preparation, inclusive of biocybersecurity, the data that are being used and the availability of the data that are being used in country and by our near peer competitors, renders our individuals at least vulnerable, if not highly viable, for not only these forms of attacks, but repeated attacks that exist under the radar. And then by the time we actually mobilize, certainly the smoking gun, if you will, is very, very difficult to detect. And any attempt at detection then becomes antagonistic and may justify a retaliatory posture by whoever we're pointing the finger at. So I think what's needed here is a program of record or a program management office that really looks at emerging technologies as threats towards a stance of preparedness and readiness.
I think the report, the National Academies report, actually made some excellent suggestions about what might be done to detect and to follow up on future attacks such as this one.
And if
Well,
I may have one more point, Ambassador, since you guys used the word detect, I would just like for the participants to realize that these type of pulsed high power microwaves are not something you can readily detect. There's no, you can't go to a store and buy a detector. It's not like your microwave oven, which operates continuously. And in fact, the very, very first commercial detector of radiation like this was developed by a British company called Kinetic with a Q, and they just rolled out their first product at the end of 2019. And that is specifically developed for these types of insults.
And it's pricey. It's not cheap.
And these things, one of them costs tens of thousands of dollars.
Right.
So it's not something that you can readily detect.
Yes, but if you immediately followed up when the injuries began to happen, you know, the injuries began in
Yeah.
the end of 2016 and continued
Yeah.
for another year. And I think we should have followed up
Uh,
at least.
Again,
at
I'm
least
going to be completely nonpartisan in this statement. It is the goal of politics in an open society to protect the polis. And if in fact intelligence informs politics that there are viable risks, harms, and threats, then acting upon those, at least in a surveillance way to be able to get the necessary intelligence so as to get to the heart of the matter, is a necessity, if not a responsible obligation. And so I think as the COVID crisis once again brought to our forefront, early response by virtue of surveillance, ongoing discourse, preparedness is going to be ever more essential, not only in terms of what might be natural threats, such as a virus or some other form of microbial and or ecological assault, but those that might be man-made, inclusive of those that might be man-made, using new technologies that allow us to harness nature in unique ways that could be injurious.
Well, thank you so much for that. I want to stay on this issue of technology. And Edl, let me ask you a question from your professorial colleague, Emil Nakle, who of course will speak for us in a few weeks. And he says, can you envision a time in the near future where shoulder-held microwave-directed energy weapons could be used in future wars against enemy forces without firing a shot? If this is possible, how could we defend against such weapons?
I do very well see this technology being man-portable, perhaps in the coming decade. It'll be a consequence of higher energy density batteries and capacitors, which are improving every year. The only real defense against these types of attacks would be to completely seal the target in a metal enclosure. And I mean completely. If you have a small gap, those gaps act as perfect receiving antennas that will allow the coupling of the energy. And as you probably realize, it is impossible, except in a laboratory environment, to completely seal, especially on the battlefield, any asset or any human 100%.
If I can add to that, the one thing is, let's not even look at something that's shoulder mounted, but let's look at something that might be mounted and or delivered by an unmanned vehicle. Realistically here, we're looking at ever more capable payloads that unmanned vehicles are able to maneuver with, carry, accommodate. And so being able, once again, to scale this type of technology down to somewhere between the 100 to 300 pound range, and then couple that to unmanned vehicles in such a way that might be then deliverable, not necessarily as a mass effect, but certainly as a disruptive effect to key operational targets. This exists in the proximate future, and it's something that we're very concerned about with regard to biosecurity.
And so effectively, there's no way to protect either soldiers or diplomats from this type of weapon unless they're completely encased in metal.
Right. I mean, you can go on the internet and find there are complete bodysuits available that have mesh in them that will protect the person. Yes. So that you can do. So if you're unprepared, no, there's nothing you can do. And it's very difficult to protect assets because assets have to communicate. And if you completely shield an asset, you'll be unable to communicate in the battlefield environment.
And I guess staying with the battlefield issue, is there any way to detect the presence of these weapons before they fire? Is there any other defensive capability we have against their utilization?
No, the ability to detect these once they're fired is only now coming onto the market. And as James mentioned, they are very expensive.
Yeah, so it speaks to at what stage is detection? Is detection looking at technological readiness level of near peer competitor, cum adversary, and by saying, all right, now they're building this weapon, and as a consequence, well, therefore it could be used. And I think that's part of it. And this goes back to the stance of preparedness, readiness, assessment, quantification of the risk and the threat, and then engaging those necessary steps to then mitigate and or prevent that threat.
So obviously these attacks happen not only in Havana, but also in China. And I think it's easy to understand what some of the motivations might have been to upset or change US policy in Cuba with these attacks. But given that they happened elsewhere as well, could you offer some speculation about the motivation for these broader kinds of attacks and why they've happened in more locations than just in Havana?
I'll take a stab at it, but I'm really going to hand this one over to Edl. A lot of our work, again, funded by Lawrence Livermore National Laboratories, and a large vote of thanks, taking a deep dive into Chinese science and biotechnology, would suggest that one of the things that our near-peer trans-Pacific competitors are looking to do is to gain hegemony in the field, really gain a foothold, not only in ways that are, for example, socioeconomically viable to corner markets, but also to allow dual use in a variety of different settings: intelligence settings, defense settings, frank military settings. Could this have been a, yeah, us too? You've got one, we've got one, and we can use it? Perhaps. Could this have also have been some form of proxy whereby it was then engaged in another competitor country to then raise the suspicions that here this other competitor country is also engaging in these activities? Perhaps as well. That's above my pay grade. That there represents something happening in the socio-political realm, and I'm but a humble neuroscientist.
Well, staying with this great question from one of our board members, Tom Johnson, are there any patterns in the demographics of how people experience these attacks? Are there any patterns we can discern from how it played out in the individuals, who were affected?
Very much so, but that's where I'm going to have to leave this, because that information remains very close hold, and some of it is high side. But there were not only identifiable patterns, but patterns that would then be descriptive and perhaps we feel predictive of early stage insult that might be then reflective of these individuals being the target for injury. But yes, indeed, not only in terms of the demographics of the individuals themselves, but in particular patterns of injury and its manifest effects.
I think it's open knowledge that the majority of the people targeted were intelligence officers in Havana. So that again, kind of points toward Russia, because uh, they didn't attack diplomats or the State Department diplomats, but they did attack intelligence agencies. So they were perhaps trying to say something to the U.S. intelligence agency that was operating in Cuba.
And then I guess a couple more questions about symptoms. There's two questions here. Why did no one experience balance problems? And then are there long-term effects to the diplomats who were sickened? And I guess where are we now with with the folks who were attacked?
The balance problems were the hallmark early stage sign and symptom. So virtually all of the individuals affected have what we call vestibular signs and symptoms: problems with equilibrium, balance problems, sensations of tumbling, what are referred to as vertiginous defects or vertigo, that ran across a spectrum of severity. So that was a hallmark feature of virtually everyone affected, number one. And number two, as regards the question of durability of signs and symptoms, not only is there persistence of the early phase signs and symptoms, but there are development of secondary and even tertiary signs and symptoms that would suggest, once again, a functional rearrangement that may or may not be evident just utilizing the current forms of neuroimaging that might require a bit more detailed analysis, such as that which you might have at autopsy.
After the National Academies report was released, I was invited by a web publication, The Conversation, to write a piece about what the technology might have been. To my amazement, it's been downloaded over 715,000 times. Several diplomats, former diplomats, emailed me and told me that they were still struggling, they need help, and please, I hope that further study can explain what happened to them.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's clear here is that this was not just, to be colloquial, tongue-in-cheek, a head tap. This was something that would lead to long-term difficulties that would essentially invalidate these very specifically targeted individuals. And what I mean by that, they represented key targets from not only local participation and acute phase participation, but long-term re-engagement with their job scope. So what you're really seeing is, by by affecting these individuals, the ripple effect with regard to capability, efficiency, cost, viability of these key assets were greatly affected.
And there's a couple questions here that are exactly on that issue in terms of how large is the field targeted by a single attack, and and more specifically, does this weapon give the opportunity to target specific people while others, within that sort of frame may not be effective? How guided is it, I guess?
Sure. Let me speak to the latter question first, and then I'll defer the former question to Edl. Specific targeting, the idea of a precision pathology, is certainly capable. Again, we had discussed earlier, would you be able to get more of a sharp shot effect if you knew certain biometrics, anthropometries, and measurements of head, and from that extrapolating what might be open cavities that could work as a capacitator or a coaxial resonator? And the answer there is, yeah, absolutely. I mean, the more I know about you, the better I can fit the suit to you. And if that suit happens to be one that's disruptive, well, there you go. The other issue is if the data are available via either open source data or purloinment of individual service jackets, you have an awful lot of data, both current data and metadata, can then be used to develop a host of things that could go bump in the night, so to speak. So the capability to develop precision pathologies and what's called one-person weapons is working just on you because of unique characteristics that you may present and or unique situations that you're finding yourself in, represent the sharpshoot phenomenon that many of these forms of engagement are really tailored to do. In terms of the actual biophysics and the electronics that are used, I defer that over to Edl. Edl?
So the answer to the question of whether you can target an individual really is based on a couple of factors. One is, what is the frequency that's used? And the other is how far away is the device from the target. If this is, let's say, a truck-mounted device that's hundreds of meters away, no, the diffraction limited beam would be too large. You wouldn't be able to target an individual person. But if you were meters to tens of meters away, and if you were using higher frequency, then yeah, you could point and target, and the spot size would be restricted to about the head of a human. So in that case, you need to have knowledge of where the people are and who the person is that you're targeting. But if you are able to have a direct line of sight access to that person, then yeah, you can target that person.
And let me support that further. I mean, some of the ongoing work that my colleagues, Doctors Balaban and Hoffer and I have done, again, primarily through our work with Special Operations Command, is that even if you have what's known as crude knowledge, a general extrapolated idea of someone's head size, it might be possible to then infer or extrapolate certain aspects of interior dimensions of the head that you might then be able to use so as to get a resonant effect of just these types of energies. So the general idea is you don't have to know the specifics about the proverbial bread box. You just have to know how big a bread box is relatively and what the internal compartments of that bread box are relative to the overall size. And you can fine tune this type of thing to some degree. The more I know, the more specifically I can go.
Let's go into a little bit of history as we kind of wrap up our conversation here. And this is a great sort of comment and question from Herb Thomas. And he says, in the 1970s, and maybe before and after, it seemed to be common knowledge that the Soviets were aiming microwaves at the American embassy in Moscow, and that embassy personnel's health might have been effective. Were those microwaves thought or known to be pulsed, or were they more or less steady? And then he makes the comment that former Deputy Secretary of State Walter Stossel Jr., who was ambassador to the Soviet Union from 74 to 76, died in 1986 of leukemia at age 66. And there was a lot of speculation then that that may have been a direct result from a microwave attack. Edl, have you come across this, or do you have things to offer about this historical piece?
So there's this famous incident of this disc being in the embassy, and it later became understood that by triggering it with microwaves, they can turn on a listening device. So that works sort of like an RFID technology, as in, like, for example, when you cross a bridge and you have an easy pass. But those power levels wouldn't be very high, and this technology of repetitively pulsed nanosecond high power microwave wasn't available yet. That technology really really took off in terms of being researched in the 1970s and 1980s. So it wouldn't be this technology at that time.
Okay.
Let me jump in here because I see it. I don't want you to close the program without some additional political commentary from me. And someone asked the question, I think it was Wendy, about future relations now with Cuba after they've been so damaged by the Trump administration. Well, according to what President Biden has said in the past, he intends to return to the Biden or the Obama Biden opening. Here's the problem, though. First of all, the embargo is in law, and the embargo is in about 5 different laws. So we do need the Senate and the House of Representatives to act and to remove entirely the embargo and the sanctions. Secondly, Senator Rubio, a Republican from Miami, Bob Menendez, a Democrat from New Jersey, Ted Cruz, a Republican from Texas, and others are all going to make it as difficult as possible. But what I believe President Biden will do in the short term is take Cuba off the terrorist list. It was just put on. That'll take 3 to 6 months because a report must be provided by the State Department and submitted to Congress. They will loosen up right away travel to Cuba. And then they will have a number of executive regulations that will be published in the Federal Register that will allow some investment, more travel, will remove sanctions, excuse me, that limit the amount of remittances, travel by aircraft to Cuba, et cetera, et cetera. Some can be done immediately. Some will have to be done by publishing new regulations. But I can assure you that there are many conservative Republicans that are going to do their best to keep the relationship in the icebox. And I think that's so unfortunate because I think when we begin to see real change in Cuba is when we have a better relationship and the Cuban people have access to more opportunity. Just just wanted to add that and also to really thank Edel and James for their excellent provision of information,
Thank you.
speculation,
Mhm.
analysis. It was really superb. So thank you both very,
Thank
very
you.
much.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. A great pleasure. We've learned an awful lot this morning. Please come back and update us. I have a feeling that this issue is not going away anytime soon.
Absolutely.
And I fear, of course, that there'll be only an expansion of this kind of technology. But James Giordano, thank you so much. Edl Schamiloglu, thank you so much. And wishing you both a great day. And thanks so much for taking the time.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
All right, and bye, everybody. We will see you in a week from today, and we'll have another fantastic talk lined up for you. So until then, take care and have a great day. Bye-bye.